I wish I could go around and shake everybody's hand. It's so nice of you to be here tonight. Oh, that reminds me of a story. One time I was invited for dinner to the home of this little couple, and they had a little 4-year-old boy. And when I walked in, they introduced me to the little boy, and he immediately burst into tears. And his mother said, "Honey, what's wrong?" And he said, all day, all I've heard is, "Dorothy Day's coming, Dorothy Day's coming." And now here she is, and she ain't nothing but an old lady. And so they wanted me to come and talk to you, and they hoped that if they gathered some people together, maybe some of you would empty your pockets so that they could get a new roof. So now you know why you're here, and now you know why I'm here. So I said, sure, I'd come back for a little while. I brought along some notes. How many of you have read that some of Dostoevsky's books? He was really, really important to me. And in one of his characters says, "All my life I have been tormented by God." And that's really, I think, how I always somehow present in my life, somehow calling me. I remember when I wrote the autobiography, I remember trying to remember back when I first met God. And I remember I was about 8 years old. I didn't tell you. Okay, let me start at the beginning. I was born November 8th, 1897 in Brooklyn, New York. And my father was a journalist, and my mother was a stay-at-home mom. I had 2 older brothers, and a younger sister, and a younger brother. And when I was about 8 years old, my father got a job with a newspaper in San Francisco. So we moved from Brooklyn, and we were actually renting a little house in Berkeley, waiting for our furniture to arrive. Big, huge Bible, and I decided that we would play school. And how many of you used to play school? How many of you were always the teacher? Yes. So I was always the teacher. And so I said to Della, "Sit down, let's play school." And so Della sat down obediently, and I opened the Bible, and I just began to read. And as I read, I became aware of this, I called it a personality then, this presence in the room. And I knew immediately that it was God. We had no religion in our house. Dad had a Bible, but we didn't go to church. They sent us to parochial school when I was like in the 1st and 2nd grade. And I remember from that we would recite the Our Father by putting our head down on the desk. But no real, sense of meeting God. But one day I was angry with one of my brothers, and I called him a bad name, and the mother of my friend wouldn't let me play with her daughter anymore. That was it. It was gone. Well, so I just found some other friends and got into trouble instead of going to church then. And then the earthquake happened. When was the earthquake in San Francisco? 1906? Okay, so the big earthquake happened. And I remember that was really, really strange. Mom and Dad, my mother and father, took my brothers and my sister out of the house and left me in my bed. And I don't know if they were going to come back and get me or not, but I remember my bed rolling across the room, and then the shaking stopped. And it was dark, it was like 2 in the morning, and I felt very alone and very frightened. But Mom, they came back in to get me then. Well, we had to leave California then because Dad lost his job. The newspaper burnt down. And so we moved to Chicago. And it was in Chicago then that I had my next, what I would say my next God experiences. My heart just flooded with love for Mrs. Harrington. And that image actually stayed with me the rest of my life. Whenever I would think of Mrs. Harrington, 10 o'clock in the morning, breakfast dishes are done, and there she is on her knees praying, my heart would just fill with love. This saint, and I decided right then and there that I was going to become a saint. And so I would kneel by my bed on the wooden floor until my knees hurt. And Della would say, Dorothy, come to bed and tell me a story. And I'd say, Della, get on your knees. We have to become saints. And so I became very kind of pious at that time also. One time I remember running across a letter that I wrote to a friend when I was 15, and it was full of all this pious stuff. So those are kind of the God experiences that ran through my early life. So, in the jungle, that's right. So, but when I read that book, it impacted me so much. Maybe because we lived in Chicago, and the book takes place in Chicago, about a migrant who works in the meatpacking plant, and the horrors, and the terrible, terrible working conditions. And I've often thought that that's when I got my vocation to work with the poor. That's really when my heart was stirred. I used to ask my mother, why is there so much injustice in the world? And she would say, well, it just is. But that didn't make sense. When we lived in the nicer part of Chicago, after we moved out of the poorer flat, one evening, the doorbell rang, and one of my siblings opened the door. My father was not happy because there at the door was the local Episcopal priest. And my dad was sitting there with his cigarette and his cocktail. And so the priest came in, and he wanted to invite everybody to come to the church. So my father, of course, said that we would do that. And of course, he didn't mean that. But he did say, he did send us, myself and my siblings, I didn't see anybody taking off their coat to give it to somebody, or opening their homes, or any of those things. And I wondered, I kept remembering the jungle, and the book The Jungle, and how could we start to make things better for people. And one day I was walking across campus, and there was this big sign that said, "Workers unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains." And I became very, very excited because here was somebody who was trying to do something. And so I walked up to see who it was, and it was the young communist group that was trying to make a difference. And so I began to hang around with it. I quit going to church. I started smoking and cursing a little bit so they wouldn't think I was still religious. And started to see what could they do. Eugene O'Neill, the playwright, became one of my very, very good friends. Oh, we all hung out in Greenwich Village, and there was a bar called the Golden Swan, and there was a back room, and that's where we all hung out. We called it the Hellhole, and then we'd all hang out there till wee small hours of the morning, and nobody ever wanted to go home. Nobody ever really wanted to be alone, and that was the first time I ever heard Francis Thompson's poem, what's the name of Francis Thompson's poem?
Hound of Heaven.
Oh, Hound of Heaven. They guided from beginning to end. And he would sit there looking very drunk and looking very dour and black, and his head would hang down on his chest, and he would recite this entire poem. Well, it fascinated me. The poem fascinated me. I knew that at some point I was going to have to confront the beginning of my life and the end of my life. I remember I could outdrink them all. I used to go from table to table singing when Frankie and Johnny were lovers. But then, wee small hours of the morning, eventually we had... One time I worked as a nurse in New Orleans, and I had a friend there that was a Catholic, and we would go to Mass together. In fact, she gave me a rosary that I always carried with me. And Forster and I had so many arguments about religion, about faith. You see, Forster wanted me to just love him. He didn't want to share me with God, with anybody, even a baby. Our beautiful, beautiful, precious daughter, Tamar Teresa, was born on March 4th. 1926. We always moved to the city during the winter because it was too cold to stay in Staten Island, or stay in the cottage. And so we had the baby, and I will have to share with you that was one of the most powerful moments in my life. The sense of God's love and God's presence filled my hospital room, and I knew that some people said they could worship God out in nature, away from church, but my connection with my communist friends had led me to believe in community, and I knew I was going to have to worship my God in a community. Right after Christmas in 1927, we had a really, really bad argument. And Forster stormed out, slamming the door like he always did. And I knew I had to put a stop to the way we were destroying one another. I knew I had to answer God's call. So I made the decision I wouldn't let him back in. The next morning I called Sister, and I just said, I'm ready. And she said, meet me at the church tomorrow morning. I knew I could write to raise awareness, but I wanted to do something. But they didn't want me out there with them. Because 5 years before I had become a Catholic, and there was this philosophical difference. So they didn't want me there. As soon as the march was over, I wrote my story. And then I went to the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception. This was December 8th, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. The shrine was just being built. And I went there and I knelt and I cried and I begged God to please show me how I could use my gifts to help the poor. What could I do? Please, God, show me. We needed roundtable discussions for clarification of thought. And we needed agronomic universities. Anybody know what an agronomic university is? Farms. He said we needed farms where the unemployed could learn to grow their own food and maybe create cottage industries. Now, Peter had a way of inspiring, and for me, and lots of people, but I grabbed hold of his ideas, and I was excited, but I was really excited when he said that we were going to make this plan known by starting a newspaper. I knew how to do a newspaper. I was a journalist. At one point, Michael Gold had made me editor of the Social Call, so I knew how to set up a newspaper. 2,500 copies and went to Union Square. Now this was the Communist Labor Day. There were hundreds of thousands of communists there that day. And they were on one side of Union Square selling their paper called The Daily Worker. And we were on the other side of Union Square selling ours, saying, "Read the Catholic Worker daily." It sold for a penny a copy. It still sells for a penny a copy. You can subscribe to it through the New York Catholic Worker. Is it not possible to be radical and not atheist? I close by writing, "The money for the printing of the first issue was raised by begging small contributions from friends. A priest in Newark sent us $10 and the prayers of his congregation. A sister in New Jersey, garbed also in holy poverty, sent us $1. Another kindly and generous friend sent $25. The rest of it the editors squeezed out of their own earnings. And at that, they were using money necessary to pay milk bills, gas bills, and electric light bills." But the people came to help. The volunteers came, the donations came in. And so we had to have some place to put these volunteers, mostly college people who couldn't find jobs, but wanted to help out and caught the vision. So we started houses of hospitality for our volunteers. We always had lots of clothing that was donated, and people would come to get clothes. And Peter always said we had to have a pot of coffee going, and a pot of mulligan stew on the stove, and there was always bread. I first wrote against the Spanish Civil War, and we lost many, many subscribers. We lost many people who lived in the house. But you know, I couldn't be anything but a pacifist. I couldn't be anything but against war, because that's in the spirit of Jesus. Jesus taught us to forgive our enemies, to love our enemies, to do good for our enemies. And so I continue to write against the wars. This is how I closed my autobiography. We were just sitting there talking when Peter Warren came in. We were just sitting there talking when lines of people began to form saying, "We need bread." We could not say, "Go, be thou filled." If there were 6 small loaves and a few fishes, we had to divide them. There was always bread. We were just sitting there talking, and people moved in on us, that those who can take it, take it. Some moved out, and that made room for more, and somehow the walls expanded. We were just sitting there talking, and someone said, "Let's all go live on a farm." It was as casual as all that, I often think. It just came about. It just happened. I found myself a barren woman, the joyful mother of children. It is not always easy to be joyful, to keep in mind the duty of delight. The most significant thing about the Catholic worker is poverty, some say. The most significant thing is community, others say. We're not alone anymore. But the final word is love. At times it has been, in the words of Father Soshima, a harsh and dreadful thing, and our very faith and love has been tried through fire. We cannot love God unless we love each other, and to love we must know each other. We know Him in the breaking of bread, and we know each other in the breaking of bread, and we're not alone anymore. Heaven is a banquet, life is a banquet too, even with a crust, where there is a companionship. We've all known the long loneliness, and we have learned that the only solution is love. Love comes with community. It all happened while we were sitting there talking, and it is still going on. To keep sitting around talking, to figure out how can you use your gifts to help the poor, to reduce the violence, to stop the wars. It can happen if you just keep sitting around talking. I'm coming. I'm on my way. Thank you so much for letting me be here with you.